with Robert Spencer, the very well-known author, and really out there in the forefront of this great cultural debate that we're having, and sometimes it progresses beyond a debate, quite frankly, and that's not always a good thing, but at least it's never boring. Mr. Spencer, welcome to Wings of the Eagle. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great honor to have you. Personally, I've been reading your stuff for, I'm trying to remember how long. I mean, I was reading David Horowitz in college, so that's how strange I was. And
Great.
that's back in 1995-ish. So it's been quite a while, and I've been a fan of yours for many years. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you.
I wanted to let, if you don't know, folks out there, jihadwatch.org is Robert's site. I highly encourage you to go there and read everything on it. Tons of great information, a lot of breaking news kind of stories and things that you should be focusing on. You have a series of books basically called The Complete Infidels Guide to ... And the latest one is Free Speech and Its Enemies. Can you just give us a quick once-over about what that's about?
Absolutely. The Complete Infidels Guide to Free Speech and Its Enemies is a guide to how there are concerted efforts on an international level and in the United States itself at very high places, very powerful people. And this is not a conspiracy theory, it's all out in the open, but they are working to infringe upon our freedom of speech, which is the absolute prerequisite and indispensable element of a free society. They are working to curtail the criticism of Islam and essentially make it impossible not just to speak negatively about this religion, which probably most people would not be interested in doing anyway, but in exploring the ways in which jihad terrorists use the teachings of Islam to justify what they're doing and to make recruits among Muslims who are peaceful. And if we are not able to speak about that, and that is already rapidly becoming a reality all over the country, then there's nothing we can really do about terrorism because we won't be able to confront the motivating ideology behind it. And if you do not know an enemy, you cannot defeat that enemy. And especially if you refuse to understand what that enemy is all about, then you will never be able to defeat him.
What is your opinion or understanding about why this is? Why the fear?
Well, there is a very skillful effort that's been conducted for years now by Islamic advocacy groups which have ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Islamic Society of North America and others. And they have for years claimed that any honest discussion about how jihadis use Islam to further their ends is racism, is bigotry, is hatred. And I always thought that was ridiculous, but they just always kept at it, never broke character, never said, yes, we know this is ridiculous as well, but we are using it for political purposes. They always maintained that this is what it was. And I realized that it is a very effective tactic, really, that they played on the national trauma of the United States, which is racism, and were able to portray themselves as victims of it, even though jihad and Islam itself are not a race, and Muslims are not all of one race, and there are Muslims and Islamic jihadis of all races. And so the idea that this has something to do with racism is ridiculous. But they played that card very well and got the entire American left on board to think that it was racism to resist jihad terror. And the real insidious, dangerous aspect of this was illustrated by an incident that I recount in the book that took place about 10 or 12 years ago. There was a plot to shoot up an army base. These Muslims at Fort Dix in New Jersey, they were going to go into Fort Dix and shoot as many American soldiers as possible before they themselves were killed. And then they thought they would receive the Quran's promise of paradise guaranteed to those who kill and are killed for Allah. And so they were planning this, but they made a big mistake. They went into a video store. This is some time ago, remember, and they had these VHS tapes of jihad, gory beheadings and so on. And they asked the man who worked at the video store, a young man, to transfer the VHS tapes to DVD. While he was doing the job, he saw what was on them, and he was alarmed. He went to his boss and he said, I'm seeing some very disturbing things on these videos. Should I go to the police, or would that be racist? Now, The idea that he did ultimately go to police, but this is a true story, and the idea that he actually hesitated because he thought it might be racist to oppose jihad terror shows how effective this propaganda campaign has been, and people really are scared. Same thing happened a couple years ago when two Muslims shot 15 people at a Christmas party in San Bernardino, California. All summer before that, their neighbors had been disturbed by a lot of suspicious goings on, strange comings and goings in the middle of the night, a lot of unsavory characters going in and out of the house, and they didn't do anything. And they explained after the shooting they didn't want to be guilty of racial profiling. And so here again we have been told day after day, year after year, for so many years since 9/11 and also before 9/11, that to oppose jihad terror is racism, it's Islamophobia, it's bigotry, and people have internalized it. And this is a direct assault upon the freedom of speech in kind of an indirect. It's a direct assault, but it happened indirectly in that it wasn't outlawed, it wasn't officially curtailed. We weren't commanded from on high that we had to not speak ill of Islam, but it's just become accepted in the culture. And I think Hillary Clinton summed it up a few years ago when she was Secretary of State. And she said, after she signed on the U.S. to agree to a resolution at the UN to criminalize incitement to religious hatred, which is a very elastic term, she explained at a meeting in Istanbul with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that, of course, we have the First Amendment and we can't just outlaw criticism of Islam, but we can use old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, she said. And that's worked very well. That's exactly what they are doing.
And of course, that's a great tactic of our friends on the left to stop
Yes.
anything they don't like. Is to shame. Don't shame them. Interesting. So this is obviously a pan national issue. It's not just America that this is happening to. For example, about 2 Christmases ago, I bought one of your books for my aunt and uncle. My aunt is a staunch Catholic, and so I bought her the Inside Islam Guide for Catholics that you wrote, which I highly recommend, by the way, because it's such a hard in. It's tough to get into that conversation with folks who, I guess, default to the fact that, well, you believe in God or you believe in religion, you must be a good person at heart, and there's no possible way that any of this stuff about Islam encouraging it could be true. Do you experience that all the time?
Oh yeah, all the time. People assume if it's a religion, it must teach love and peace. It must teach the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of men. Nobody can conceive, or few people can conceive, although more and more are all the time just by the force of reality. But few people can conceive of the possibility of a religion that actually teaches hatred and violence and warfare. It's beyond. It's just inconceivable to most people.
Right, and that's something we have to break through, because clearly in the text, and like hopefully I would encourage any listener or viewer here to buy a Quran if you don't have one, to look at the Hadith, right, to look at the source materials, because that's just where all this stuff is coming from. I think you constantly point this out. It's not just that it's some fringy thing over here that this cult believes. It's very mainstream and goes all the way back to the source of Muhammad. And to not do these things is strange, right?
Yeah, it's really quite obvious. It's not really hard. It's mystified me over the years, the kind of reception that I've gotten, because all I did was read the Quran and say what was in it. And I read the Hadith and said what was in it. It's not really rocket science here. It's just, it's obvious, it's plain that Islam teaches violence, warfare against unbelievers. But you mentioned that you bought Inside Islam, a Guide for Catholics, for your aunt and uncle. And I thought that it was important to note that this effort is going on also within the Catholic Church, the effort to stifle all criticism of Islam and even just honest exposition of its teachings, because that's really all that book is. And yet there is an initiative called the Bridge Initiative out of Georgetown University, funded by the Saudis, and coming from the Saudi-funded Al-Walid bin Talal. That's the prince who funds this whole initiative. And it's the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University, which is ostensibly a Catholic university. And the Bridge Initiative now, which is part of this center, has started a campaign to get Catholic bookstores and Catholic institutions not to carry my books and not to invite me to speak and so on. And they're claiming, well, see, it's Islamophobia and so on, to speak about these things. Now, what's most noteworthy in the Bridge Initiative's dossier about me is they quote all these things I say as if they're self-evidently false. But they don't refute any of them, and they can't refute any of them because they're simply true. They're just banking on the ignorance of the people who run the bookstores or the people that they're targeting in other places, and who to think that, yes, Islam is love and peace because all religions are, and so therefore if Spencer is saying that it teaches warfare against and subjugation of unbelievers, he must be a racist, bigoted, and Islamophobe, and we must by all means remove our books from the bookstore and so on. And this is yet another indication of how the freedom of speech, and particularly criticism of Islam, as I detail in the book, is being rapidly curtailed, and there are active efforts to do this now in the United States.
And this is a common theme, right? You play on the ignorance of these folks. They just
Very
don't
common,
know.
yes.
They just don't know what's in there. So you've been banned from the UK.
Same thing, Chris. I was banned from the UK. I was actually right here in my office, and the FedEx truck drove up right out in front and came to the door, and the FedEx guy was a little bit awed. I was surprised because, you know, they're usually just doing their work. And he said, "It's from the British government." And I had to sign for it, and I opened up the letter from the UK Home Office, and it said, "You are not allowed to come to the UK." You can read the letter on my website. I scanned it in and put it up, and it says, "Because you said Islam has a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers," which is like saying you can't come to the UK because you said water was wet. It's just a plain denial of an obvious reality. But they didn't say because you're a criminal. I don't have any criminal record. They didn't say because you're inciting violence. I don't incite violence. They didn't say anything except that I said Islam had doctrines of violence, which is obviously true, and they banned me on that basis. It's the war against the freedom of speech today is a war against reality.
Amen. Oh, and has this changed with the new government coming in? Has anything happened with this?
No, it was from the letter was officially from the UK Home Office, which is I'm not quite sure what the equivalent is in the U.S. Department of the Interior or something. But in any case, the head of the UK Home Office at that time was Theresa May, who is now the Prime Minister. So the ban is stronger than ever. She was actually bragging about it over the winter. She gave a speech in London or somewhere in the UK and said that she had banned Pamela Geller and me, my colleague, who we were going to go to the UK at that time to lay a wreath at a memorial for Lee Rigby, the British soldier who was beheaded on a street in London. And that's all we were going to do. But in any case, May was bragging that she had banned us because she said she had also worked to prosecute Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada. Now, Abu Hamza is an Islamic Jihad terrorist who is in prison now in the U.S. for trying to start an al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. And she was equating, and Abu Qatada is also a jihad terrorist, and she was equating us with these killers, these people who want to commit mass murder. She was equating our words with their murderous actions. And that just is more of this insanity that governs the world today.
Yeah, unfortunately, right. Do you expect to see more of it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, just recently I was invited to speak in Canada. And then the organizers came back and said, really, we're embarrassed about this, but we have to disinvite you because we're afraid that you would get stopped at the border, maybe barred from the country, maybe even arrested, because there is this fellow Wild Bill. I'm not too familiar with his work, but Bill Finley, and he goes by Wild Bill. And recently he was invited to speak in Canada. And he went to the border, and he said that he made a video about it that I posted at my website, Jihad Watch. And he said that he was only going to speak about the mistreatment of women under Islamic law, which is another obvious reality. The Quran even allows, it says that men should beat women who they fear disobedience from. And he was stopped at the border and held at the border control for 8 hours while they searched his iPod, and then they confiscated his iPod, one of these things, you know, one of these electronic things. He had his notes on for his talk. And he said, ironically, he was going to speak about the mistreatment of women in Islam and about the war against the freedom of speech. and they kept his device. They confiscated it. They said that they suspected him. They arrested him for what was it? Smuggling hate speech into Canada. Now, this is after Canada passed what was supposed to be a non-binding resolution condemning Islamophobia, which is a trumped-up word in the first place to go to stand for any criticism of Islam and to intimidate people into thinking there's something wrong with it. And anyway, it's obviously the Canadian government is not acting as if it's a non-binding resolution, but they're acting as if it's law now and arresting people for criticizing Islam. And in light of what happened to Wild Bill and a few other incidents like that in Canada that happened to Canadian citizens, the organizers of the event decided not to invite me into Canada. And I thought, yeah, it's a shame. I have friends there and I like going there, but it is very dangerous now. And clearly the Canadian government, like the British government, is at a war against the reality and a war against the freedom of speech and is stifling criticism of Islam. And so it's not a good time to go.
Do they believe in their heart of hearts? Do you think they're saving lives by doing this, by giving people like you who won't respond violently a hard time, that they're going to save? For example, when you were in Texas and Pamela that one time, people try to kill you. Do they think they're saving people from that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that they're in full appeasement mode with Islamic jihadis. And they think if we just, Muhammad Atta said it, the 9/11 hijacker, when he hijacked the plane on September 11th, 2001, he got on the intercom and he said to the passengers, just stay quiet and you'll be okay. And of course, they did stay quiet. They figured he was going to land the plane somewhere, and they were not okay. He smashed it into the World Trade Center. Now, the moral of the story, I think, is one that has been completely missed by American authorities and by authorities all over Europe and the Canadians as well, that they think if we just stay quiet, we'll be okay. And we're going to smash into the building as well. They think if we don't criticize Islam, if we don't say anything negative about Islam, if we even include in that quiet, in that silencing, in that self-censorship, even counterterror analysis. The Obama administration's counterterror program that's still in place, by the way, is called countering violent extremism. There's no mention of Islam. It doesn't have anything to do with Islam because, of course, we all know Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. And so I think if they just stay quiet, then Muslims won't get mad and won't attack us.
Didn't they disinvite you from that, too?
Yeah, not strictly from that. I was before that was in place. I used to instruct FBI and military groups about the Quran and Muhammad, taking them into the mindset of the terrorists and showing them what they believed and what they wanted to do. And all that was stopped by the Obama administration as they were constructing their countering violent extremism program.
Right. Well, because if you have violent extremism, you have to include everyone.
Right-wing extremists such as us.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. Very violent in our rhetoric.
Yes.
So, just a quick 1 minute, how does little Robbie Spencer grow up to want to do this?
Oh, I never wanted to do this. I did always think I was going to be a writer, but I was going to be the next great novelist. And unfortunately, that's the great novel is going to have to wait. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. But the thing is, my family is from that part of the world. My grandparents were exiled from the last caliphate, unless you count ISIS, the Ottoman Empire, and they were exiled for refusing to convert to Islam. And I was very interested in all that when I was very young. It actually took me a long time to piece together what I just told you. It took 5 seconds to say, but many years for me to discover the whole truth of what had happened. And in the course of studying and looking into what had happened, I was led right into Islam because it was really all about Islam. And so I read the Quran for the first time while I was in college, and had a lot of Muslim friends there actually who were trying very hard to convert me, and I had many interesting discussions with them. And a lifelong fascination was born. Of course, after 9/11, that became something that people were interested in, and I was asked by a group that I was consulting for about these issues to write a book about it, and I did, and wrote another, and the 17th is coming out in November.
Gosh, only 17? Wow. Proficient, Robert Spencer. And don't call him Richard, by the way. Do not do that, please.
Thank you.
I'm never going to do it, I promise. For some reason, this is a problem on Twitter. Now, Robert Spencer is a very good man. Thank you for doing what you do. So I just will close it out here by basically just saying, what do you think is the most important out of all these topics? And we know we see the caliphate. And by the way, as obviously you tell people often, the Muslim Brotherhood, the whole point of their existence is to bring back the caliphate, the one that exiled your family. So this is a real thing that's happening. It's not just some obscure, nerdy topic.
It's interesting because years and years ago, many years ago, probably before you were born, I was in a debate with this Muslim who was criticizing what I was saying about dhimitude. Dhimitude is the institutionalized discrimination against non-Muslims in Islamic law. And he said, well, that's a relic of history. It was abolished by the Ottoman Empire in 1856 and in Egypt in 1859. And it doesn't exist in the Islamic world today, and nobody's talking about bringing it back. And so you're just talking historical relics and fear-mongering. And just a few years later, of course, Hamas announced that once they were fully in power, they were going to collect the jizya, which is the hallmark of the dhimmi status, the second-class status for the Jews and Christians. They were going to collect it from the Christians who were in the Palestinian areas. And then ISIS came and occupied at its height a territory larger than Great Britain and did indeed impose the dhimmi laws on the Christians in its domains and collected the jizya tax from them. And so these things were shown anew to be still part of Islamic law. And these realities have impinged upon us in all kinds of ways. Also, when I started this work publicly, many, many people would say, well, look at Turkey. Turkey is a Muslim country, but it's secular, and that's the wave of the future for the Islamic world. And you'll see in 10 years and 15 years, many, many more Muslim countries will be like Turkey. When what really happened was that the Turks actually dismantled the secularism and are rapidly reimposing Islamic law. And no other countries have done anything like move toward democracy. They've only moved away from it in the Islamic world.
All right, let's hope they don't become more like Turkey. Erdogan is quite the character, and I'm sure he would love to be the new caliph.
Yes.
What would you say in general to the West, to America? What is the most important thing about Islam that we in the West have to know right now?
I would say that it is not just a religion, but a political system. And it's a political system that is authoritarian, supremacist, and violent. And that there are Muslims, individuals and organizations that are working right now in the West to subvert our own political system and to replace it with their own. Do I think that they will succeed? I do not, at least in the short term and also in the long term. It would be many, many years before the United States adopts Islamic law. But what will happen is a great deal of civil strife, which is already beginning, and a great deal of ruined lives and lost lives as they attempt to achieve their goals. And this is what is happening now. We need to wake up to the reality of this and work to defend our own laws. The idea of the freedom of religion is often invoked in this context, and people say, you can't do anything about this because we have the First Amendment, and they're just living out their religion. And that is absolutely true, but the First Amendment was never intended by the Founding Fathers to be some sort of suicide pill. It was never intended to be anything but something that would protect and strengthen the United States. And the idea that it would be used against the United States is something they would have found ridiculous. The First Amendment freedom of religion is not a license to commit treason. It is not a license to commit sedition or subversion or to break any other laws. We need to enforce revive and enforce the principle of one law for all and equality of rights of all before the law. This is what is being lost today. People don't realize it, but there are attempts to bring Islamic law into the United States bit by bit and piece by piece. And there are attempts to stifle any discussion about this and to demonize and stigmatize anybody who does discuss it. And these things have to be resolutely resisted, or we surely will lose many, many freedoms. Above all, in the first place, the freedom of speech. Once you can't criticize Islam, then there's no freedom of speech at all. You've established a protected class in the United States, and you have destroyed the principle of the freedom of speech, and with it, the principle of a free society. And those who are in power can dictate to the rest of us. This is the road we are heading down unless we stop it at this before it's too late.
And a lot of nations in Europe are already at this point because there is no First Amendment per se.
Yes, absolutely. And so there's no free society. And it's already rapidly happening. Facebook, people don't know. It sounds unbelievable even when I say it. But Joel Kaplan, the vice president of Facebook, recently flew to Islamabad in Pakistan, and he promised the Pakistani government that Facebook would take down all criticism of Islam. And sure enough, Jihad Watch, which is my website that only tracks terrorist activity and jihad activity in the United States and around the world and explains its ideology, has been cut off from Facebook. It's still there, but you can't refer from it. A lot of people can't see it. It's shadow banned. And the referrals from Facebook to Jihad Watch dropped to 90% in February and have never recovered. And many other sites have experienced the same thing. Facebook sites critical of Islam and jihad have been just shut down. And Facebook is implementing essentially Islamic blasphemy laws. It's the same thing with Google. Google recently changed the way it runs its searches so that only favorable results will come up. If you search for Islam or jihad or Sharia, terms like that, you're only going to get material about how Islam is peaceful. You're not going to get anything about how Islamic jihadis use the teachings of Islam to justify terrorism. That's all buried now. And so we are rapidly losing the freedom of speech, rapidly losing the right to say anything we want to. You know, nobody minds when you criticize Christianity. Right. But if you criticize Islam now, it's out of bounds. And this is a very dangerous thing that threatens all of our other freedoms.
Right, amen. And this is at its core, I think it's a spiritual issue, and that's why, as a Christian as I am, and as you are as well, I believe, what would you say now the most important thing for the church to hear about Islam is?
Well, here again, it's authoritarian, supremacist, and violent. It has in the Quran what it says is the correction of Christianity, and contradicts many Christian teachings on the basis of saying this is the real truth about what Jesus said. And this is the real truth of Christianity that the Christian leaders have distorted. And even the New Testament is distorted and has been changed by the Christians. And so this is the real truth. And so it's got what it considers to be a built-in refutation of Christianity and the true version of Christianity, which is Islam. And so there is intensive proselytizing by Muslims among Christians, and many leading jihad terrorists have been ex-Christians, like Adam Gadon, who was very high up in Al-Qaeda before he was killed by a drone strike a few years back, and John Walker Lind, the young man from California, who was found fighting for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda against American troops in Afghanistan, and John Georgelis, who is very high up in ISIS, is also a convert from Christianity from Texas. Now, there are many, many others, but most of the churches do not have any recognition of this and do not have any way to equip their young people to withstand the arguments that the Muslims are presenting. And the churches, in many cases, churches of all kinds, of all denominations, are pursuing Muslim-Christian dialogue, which is supposed to be solving all these problems. And yet it's really just an exercise in futility, as the Muslim side approaches it as a method of proselytizing, right, which the Christian leaders appear unaware of. And the Christian leaders have readily agreed to refrain from talking about unpleasant issues in these dialogue sessions, such as the Muslim persecution of Christians. And so I think, well, then what good is it? If you can't deal with the real problems, then it's just a waste of time. Maybe you go away feeling good, but not one Christian has been saved from persecution. Not one church has been saved from being burnt. And the Muslim persecution of Christians in the Middle East still continues.
Right, right. And that's, I think you really nailed it, is, are you equipped to deal with it? Are the churches teaching the folks how to deal with this when it comes to you? Because it probably will. And in my area, in my town, most Muslims, there's been a huge, the last, I'd say about 2 years, move towards extreme. You've got the women in the full niqab. I mean, everything's going on, and they're not immigrants. They're converts. And I mean, 90+% where I live is like that. And they're not just, happy-go-lucky types. They're for real, for serious. Let's get real with our Islam type of people. And that should be concerning to, if we're part of a nation that is full of churches and things. Well, how can this even be possible. So I agree with you. This is a huge thing. Anything else that you wanted to make sure people know? And obviously we want to make sure everyone who's listening or viewing goes to jihadwatch.org, because Facebook doesn't work. So go right to the website. Hopefully we've got some good security firms there keeping it up and running for Robert. And pick up all the stuff. Again, the newest book is called The Complete Infidel's Guide to Free Speech and Its Enemies. And it's pretty clear that at this point in the world that Islam is quite literally an enemy of free speech and an enemy of the gospel, because they want to say, yes, we are superseding this previous message, this previous guy, Jesus. Oh, by the way, Jesus is a Muslim, and when he comes back, he's going to make sure you're all Muslims too. So,
that's right.
So that's where I'm looking at. If God would allow something like that to happen, we have to be equipped and get educated, and you're a big factor in that. So I thank you, Robert, for doing what you do.
Thank you. Yes. Appreciate your time.